everyone, to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell, and today on Here We Are, we have another one of our local luminaries, Lise Sparrow. Lisa is the pastor of Guilford Community Church, and she's here with us this afternoon to talk about a number of things. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. Lisa's been the pastor of Guilford Church since 2000. So we're talking a huge span of time in which there have been many, many changes in the church locally and in churches in general in the country. So we're going to touch on a lot of different subjects today. So we're going to get started. Lisa, if you could just talk a little bit about your early years when you grew up, where you grew up, and what it was like.
My father was a civil engineer, so I moved 22 times before I was 14. And I ended up in Berkeley, California. So during my middle school and teenage years, I was in Berkeley, and I went to Cal Berkeley for my college years. Mm-hmm. But I think the travel and the constant movement of my father meant that I was always interested in travel. Mm-hmm. And so as a high school senior, I went to Argentina as an exchange student. And mm-hmm. then when I was in college, I went to Germany for a couple years and ended up at School for International Training.
Oh, wow. Here you are. Here you are in Brattleboro.
Here I am.
Yeah.
So it was the perfect school for me, the perfect time.
Yeah.
And I ended up doing teaching ESL and training teachers at SIT in teaching Spanish, teaching uh-huh. English second language, and ultimately teaching intercultural communication, which really was my passion for 30 years. Mm-hmm.
So that was the 70s. You ended up here sometime in the 70s.
Right, 75.
Yeah. What was the path that you were following? You know, you were doing ESL and you did a lot of traveling, but did you have a calling? Did you feel, a lot of people, when they enter the ministry, they had some kind of a calling, something that really spoke to them?
I was a child of the 60s, let's remember that.
Yes.
And in the 50s, when I was 8, I remember being in the Episcopal Church, which was the church in which I grew up, and my mother, we were churchgoers. I remember thinking, I would like to be a minister. Mm. And I remember saying that to my mother one Sunday. I remember the actual day, and she kind of tapped me and said, "Oh no, women can't be pastors." And so that's really shut it down for quite a while, mm-hmm. Until in the late, I guess it was in the 70s or late 60s that they started ordaining women, not to ministry, but to being deacons in the Episcopal Church. Mm. So there was a glimmer of hope. But there was really nothing until later. In the 80s, ordination of women was becoming more common, uh-huh. and I went to divinity school then, and even so in Cambridge they weren't ordaining women, so I went back to my work as a professor.
Oh, wow. Isn't that amazing to think back on how much it has changed?
It is.
And a mother saying to her child, that just flat out, and it wasn't a negative thing like you couldn't, it was a bad thing to be, but it just, women just weren't priests or ministers.
Right.
It just wasn't what was done.
Right. It always seemed a little odd to me that it wasn't a possibility, but it was the truth as it stood.
Yeah, it was. And so you did go back to SIT for a while, and then what happened?
My first sabbatical was this journey to study faith development at Harvard Divinity School, and that's uh-huh. when I was encouraged to consider ministry and then turned down because of being a woman. Mm-hmm. And then I continued for another 15 years at SIT teaching.
Oh, wow.
And I actually got a doctorate in multicultural education, uh-huh. and it was really the call of the church that got me into it.
And what was that? How did that?
It's a little bit of a long story, but I had done an internship at Guilford Church when I was at Divinity School. Mm-hmm. The UCC, the United Church of Christ, was ordaining women, and the local minister of the UCC Church here, Shirley Crockett, and I were friends, and she needed somebody to fill in, and she knew that I was interested in ministry. Mm-hmm. I still had not realized that I was going to be a UCC pastor. I was still thinking I was an Episcopalian. Mm-hmm. But I served that church. So 15 years later, when they were in dire straits, because Shirley had passed away and they had had a couple of pastors and nothing had really worked out, they called me in extremis and asked if I could help them with a person who was dying. And as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, you've been there since then. Yeah, I think, I was thinking about this, preparing for today, and thinking about, people often talk about having a calling, and thinking about actually the word vocation, which actually means calling, and so can you articulate what the motivating, what compelled you to want to be a minister, to want to be in the church?
Well, first, I grew up with a background that was embedded in the church. I had, my father's family was Baptist, and my second cousin was a missionary in Africa for 17 years in Liberia. My mother's family had always been in the Episcopal Church, and her side of the family was Presbyterian, had been Presbyterian, and had some pastors. So it was something that was in our family.
Yes, right.
In our family, women that weren't necessarily ministers, but they ministered. So there was that part. Then if you translate it into modern day, SIT, at the time I remember a person did her master's thesis that 80% of the people who were at SIT at that time had considered ministry.
Oh, interesting.
So it was sort of our generation's vision, incarnation of what it is to do good in the world, really, and to have the world be a good place, peaceful place.
And all these other things were going on at the same time, all of the peace marches and people being affiliated with AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, and the protest marches, and all of the different ways that we were trying to be involved and to change the world, So I can see how, and also having an upbringing like that. It makes a lot of sense.
Also, I'm a product, and I know you and I talked about it. We're products of our generation. I was in Berkeley in the '60s. I grew up there, so the idea of social action is just part of.
Yes.
And the Bay Area is a very, very, very diverse, multicultural context, and the high school I went to was very diverse. So, our environment really affects us.
Well, and those are a lot of factors going into whether it was making a decision on your part or where you were headed, what direction you were heading in. And also, I'm thinking at that time, there were so many of us who were going into different kinds of spirituality, and investigating certainly a lot of Eastern religions. And yoga was barely happening at that time. So I think it's interesting that you were doing something in the midst of Berkeley, California, which was, alternative central, that you were thinking about, the church, and the church, as your surround. I'm going to jump a little bit here, but I did start thinking about how nowadays, a lot of people talk about that they're spiritual but not religious. There's sort of this kind of dialogue that's going on. Do you have any comments on that? Not that there's necessarily a difference between, but there seems to be almost a need for delineation when people speak about it.
Right. Well, people are pretty anti-authority and anti-institutional, and I think that's the legacy of our generation. Yeah. Really. I was thinking this yesterday because I was at a clergy meeting, and we actually had a conversation about changing our name from the Brattleboro Area Interfaith Clergy to Brattleboro Area Interfaith Leaders Association, which we also were thinking of alliance. And I thought last night about how much things have changed, and this does get back to your question of spiritual but not religious, is that when I first came in 2000, I was the only woman, everybody was Christian, and when the September 11th tragedy happened, we welcomed in the local Jewish and Muslim leader. So we were so open that they did that. And then, of course, as things have gone on, there became more women that were Christian. Yesterday's table, I think there were 3 of us who were ordained clergy, and the rest are all leaders of spiritual communities, whether it be Baha'i or Quaker or Christian Science. It's much more secular. I mean, much more of a, I don't know if it's secular. It's still spiritual, but it's exactly what you're talking about. But it's not, the authority that people have is not through an institution. It's through community of faith
Yeah.
that then designates somebody as a leader, or someone self-identifies
Yes.
as a leader.
Yeah.
And that's just how things are now. I think it's amazing. to
Yeah,
me.
it is. It's incredible, and it's incredible to have that array of people in one place who all have a commonality. Your church, my understanding, is that you have such an emphasis on community.
Mm-hmm.
And, the word congregation, of course, we associate with churches, but you're really creating a community. You're down there talking to the kids before your regular service, right, and spending time with them, and you're open and welcoming. And so you've got all kinds of different people who can come to the church, who know that they're welcome there. And you're also doing a lot of different kinds of ministries as well, and youth services kind of ministries too. Can you talk a little bit about, especially the kids, getting the kids involved?
Yeah, well, first I have a passion for youth, and always have. Middle schoolers in particular, I have to say. I just love
That's brave.
that. I love that age. And I love children. So, and once I've gotten to know middle schoolers, then we do okay when they're in high school. But that's a tough time for kids to have any association with any adult. So we do trips together, and I become their companion more than their leader at that point. So I really do think, if you're talking about calling, is that I just plain love the opportunity to be with young people. So that's great. So I come into the conversation craving those opportunities. Yeah. And a church community gives me that. I mean, there are kids that I've known all their lives, and what a privilege. It's just fantastic, And
what a privilege for them as well, to have that kind of anchor, a safe anchor, where they're comfortable.
Yeah. And to learn to meet other kids. Tomorrow, day after tomorrow, we're going to go on a little trip with my confirmation class. So this is kids that are 12.
Oh, wow.
So they're getting ready to question everything. So before they do that, we're going to go visit a Hindu temple and a Buddhist temple, and just explore and see how beautiful all these different communities are before they decide everything is not what they want.
That's exciting.
Yeah,
That's
it's
very
very fun.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So you're going to go around the state a little
We're going
bit?
to Massachusetts for the day.
Yeah.
So we'll have a day to the Forest Monastery, and then the Sri Vijayana Temple in Burlington, Massachusetts.
That's going to be really. How many kids?
Yeah. So 7 kids.
7 kids. Wow, that's very, very interesting. How do you view what you're doing as a pastor? Because you're involved with so many different people, so many different age groups, and you're on call. Not only do you have a calling, but you're on call in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just an incredible privilege, is what I really think. I mean, it brings tears to my eyes. And the perfect thing for me is that it also demands quiet time, meditation, and study. So I have the time of day that I get up early at dawn. I have my reading and meditation and thinking just for myself, and it's part of my job, which is good for me because I could get off kilter otherwise maybe. And then I go out into the world and have entry into people's lives, and that's really a privilege, and all with the intention that things are going to be okay, and that we can do this, and we just have to talk and figure it out. So it's a pretty amazing job, frankly. It is huge, but I mean, it can be exhausting, but it's also just incredibly beautiful.
Yeah, and I can see how it's very personal. It's all very personal as well.
Yeah.
And I was reading that you did your master's in, what was it?
Faith development.
Faith development. I love that. There's so many phrases that came up around the church that were so interesting. So so you got a master's in faith development. Can you talk about that? What does that mean?
Well, a particular person, Sharon Parks, and was my mentor, and she followed the work of James Fowler, for people who know that. And basically, it's just tracking mystical transformation with psychological transformation, and that there's a certain age at which we can predictably revisit different questions in our lives. I don't know if it was you that I was talking to about the fact that when people are in their 40s, they usually go back and reevaluate the early choices, and they either recommit to the choices they've made, or they throw those choices out and choose something new. And it's a very predictable thing. So for me to be a pastor and be familiar with some of those stages so that if somebody is struggling, I can bring normalcy to it. You know, if somebody's aging, they've just retired, this is a whole new reconstruction of their reality and their life. And I can say, oh, look, this is the stage of life that you're now entering, and what you can expect is this, that, and the other. You know, not that everybody's experience isn't unique, but the fact that things are a little bit predictable when it comes to how you connect with the higher spirit or higher power can be a comfort for people, that they're not going crazy or things aren't just falling apart and will never come together again.
Right, and I imagine that starts also with the middle school kids.
Oh,
you know, like age 12, you know, I think for a lot of people is when you start really thinking about sort of existential thoughts, you know, that you might not know what to do with, and you have so many things going on in your body. But I also think it's comforting to know that no matter how old we are going through developmental stages.
Yeah.
You know, that continues.
That's right. And when you are with people of different ages, then you get to revisit those stages. So that's why I love middle schoolers, because they just love multiple realities. So the idea that their one reality isn't the only one, and there's this one, and there's that one, and there's this one, and there's that one. And it just keeps things open for me, too, of remembering that there's so much out there.
That's so interesting, because it's also, you know, the sort of the Harry Potter age, you know, when kids enter into that. And we did ourselves, you know, when we were kids, but in a different kind of way. You know, we didn't quite have, the fantasy thing is so much different now than it was then.
That's a good parallel.
Yeah, so the other phrase that you used was that, and I think that you've pretty much described it, is that you look at this as a responsive job, where you're responding, you know, which is also a really interesting way to describe it.
I think Buddhists talk about it as being in the now, being in the present.
Right.
But I guess Christians more see it as how do we respond with love to any situation, and what's the deepest form of love and connection we can create with anybody at one point, at any point. So it's a good challenge to keep.
Yeah, and to have in mind, and it's so funny because it's just a little change in the turn of phrase even. Like someone recently, I was listening to something and they were talking about, not instead of, but the idea of mindfulness from their point of view was about allowing, or noticing. It was about noticing. And so if you're with someone and you just start noticing that person instead of trying hard to be in the now or to be present, you know, then something relaxes. And it's just a much more, I think it's an easier entry, or it's another entry into being with a person.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too.
We have the expression in Christianity where two or more are gathered, Christ is there. So you have this idea that, okay, so the two of us are here, so what is here? What's emerging? What that wouldn't be with me or wouldn't be with you, but there's some other energy that's possible.
Yeah, something synergistic occurs.
We are more than the two.
That's right. That's right, yeah. Well, we could go on about that kind of thing for a while.
And Harry Potter, that would be a whole afternoon. That would be fun. Faith development. You could just take the Harry Potter books and just lay it out.
Yeah.
It's great.
It's interesting. Let's see, there was another, I know, I wanted to ask you, what's it like to develop a sermon? You know, you're doing a sermon every week.
Right.
So you're going to the church, you're putting on your vestments, you're standing in front of the congregation, and you've prepared. And so, can you talk a little about that?
Just the sermon part, right?
Yeah, developing a sermon, writing a sermon, you know, presenting to the congregation.
I will say, just as a little aside, that at least I have the fortune of having really fantastic musicians. So often I develop the sermon a little bit in relationship to music as well. So just to say that. But putting that aside, most Christian churches, including the Catholic Church, not including evangelical churches, have what's called the lectionary. So there's a 3-year cycle that gives us possible scripture for each week. We don't have to use it, but it gives us a structure, which is actually good, and it's a big academy of people chose the scripture that they think are most central and that carries us through. So it's not as if I start from nothing. I can read these, and I have gotten more and more, so I try to just pick one or two. I don't try to use them all, and different pastors do different things. And usually my selection comes from this responsive thing that we were talking about, is what's really up now in the nation? Like, are we struggling? And are people struggling with what's going on? Are people celebrating something? So I might tend to pick one thing or another depending on what's going on. I might choose just a phrase. I might choose a story, something that I know will be reflective of something that's going on for people in the church. It used to be, when I first started, that I would just take somebody that I was counseling, and then I would speak to that person and know that everybody, because we're human, could take something from it. I've shifted a little bit away from that, and now listen in a different way, sometimes in particular to what I know people are struggling with, but more just what either I'm interested in, like if I'm particularly thinking about something. And I trust that because we're all human, we all have the same environment, that probably what is relevant for me will have some relevance for other people. And it often surprises me that people take something from a sermon that was just a minor something, but so people do their own work. It's not as if I'm dumping, filling a pail. It's really an interactive process, and people come with the intention that I might say something valuable, and they probably, because they have that intention, they find something valuable,
Or it's just certain things resonate differently at different times.
And I consciously try to include different things. So a story, maybe a poem, maybe a biblical history piece, a little bit of something for everybody. Try to do that. Not always, but.
And it's nice to have that flexibility as well.
Oh my gosh, it's great.
Instead of having to stick to a certain liturgy or something like that. And you do have the huge music piece at Guilford Community Church.
I'm so lucky.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
And Peter Amadon and Andy Davis are both very intuitive. So we often will have conversations for half an hour about, what's the theme? What if we went this way? What if we went that way? What kind of music really fits? And for me, it really feeds the sermon process.
Oh, I bet it does, yeah.
They're very, they have such a big pool to draw from.
And you have a huge array of amazing voices as well that have been there for a long time.
Yeah.
So I was reading a little bit about the UCC, the United Church of Christ, and was really interested and very surprised. I had no idea what kind of a church it was. But one of the things I loved is that they talk about the Church of Firsts, that they've done so many things because they have such a liberal and open openness to welcoming people. And so they were the first church to ordain African Americans, to ordain a woman, to ordain a gay person, to ordain a transgender person, I believe.
A disabled person.
And a disabled person, right, as well. And to affirm the right of same-sex marriages. So you're in a community that not only, these are all topical things. These are all things that have happened, in a very short period of time.
Years, yeah.
Right. But I know that it goes way back, and I wonder if you could talk about the UCC a little bit, because I think a lot of people, when we see congregational church, that means that it's the United Church of Christ, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So we can talk as far back as John Robinson, who sent the Mayflower off, if you can imagine it, to Holland. This is the Protestants that were protesting. And he said, there is still more light to be seen from the Holy Word. In other words, we don't really understand what the Bible really means, what Christ really has in store for us. And so there was always this idea that, the love is not big enough. We have to embrace these new things. So always trying to have God's love be as big as possible. So there was the slave ship that they gave sanctuary to free the slaves. There were in the Holocaust, there was the sanctuary for children. Always this idea of social justice is really part of the marrow of the congregational church. It's really the original Protestant church that wanted the church to be the people. And we have this concert coming up called By the People, for the People.
That's right.
And it's really that. It's the idea that Christ is in each of us and we are here to serve each other. It's pretty great.
And that concert is coming up this weekend, isn't it?
This Saturday.
At the Latches?
At the Latches, 7 p.m.
Oh, that's nice synchronicity.
Yeah, I'm not sure
That's
this will be
great.
on by then, but...
Good point. But if you went to the concert, I hope
you
that
can
you
cut this
enjoyed
part
it.
out,
Yeah.
but-
We're talking just because we are running out of time, but one of the phrases that I love when you were talking about, setting the Mayflower off for more light is love multiplies,
Yeah.
And to me, that's sort of what I always go back to as well, is that, there's, to live with that kind of bounty, within you.
Extravagant love.
Oh, right, that's right. That wonderful phrase of the UCC. What is that phrase again? The Church of Extravagant Welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful phrase. It's
Yeah.
wonderful. And great so great for you to be part of that and to be doing everything you're doing.
I know, it's like I just wasn't meant to be in the Episcopal Church. UCC is the church for me.
No, you were sort of shunted right
Yeah.
along the way.
I have a lot of stories that I can tell
I'll
about
bet.
that kind of shoving. And even just to be in Guilford, where they're farm people, and also the artist community of Brattleboro. And
Yeah.
my family, that is an expression of who my family was.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we are out of time, and I feel like we just scratched the surface, really.
Yeah,
but
well, thank you, Andy.
it was wonderful to talk with you, Lisa.
And
I
thank
really
BCTV.
appreciate it. Yes, and by the way, last week the Guilford Church won the BCTV Award for Community Nonprofit Partnership.
Yep.
So you've got a little statue of some
We
kind.
do.
That's
We
so
do.
great.
It's in our sanctuary for the moment, at least.
That's great. It's
Yeah.
a good time for the church.
Yeah, it is
Thanks
a good
so
time.
much.
Okay, thank
Great
you,
to
Wendy.
see you.
Thanks.
So thank all of you for joining us today. It was great to hear about yet another wonderful part of our community that's strong and vibrant. It has a lot of people and music and people coming together. So join us next week. We will be here with another guest, and thanks for tuning in and being with us on Here We Are.